The most dangerous men in the city never chased attention. They simply decided where to look, and someone's life changed forever. Every fall, the Blackwood Foundation hosted its Legacy Gala, an invitation-only evening where politicians, executives, philanthropists, and the city's most influential families gathered beneath glittering crystal chandeliers to celebrate another year of charitable success. Everyone knew the event carried another unspoken purpose. It was the only night each year when Damian Blackwood, the 29-year-old heir to the Blackwood family empire, appeared in public without an entourage making speeches on his behalf. Every Omega in attendance understood the rumors. If Damian noticed someone, even for a moment, opportunities followed. Invitations arrived. Careers changed. Entire family names rose overnight. Long before the ballroom doors opened, elegant guests rehearsed conversations, adjusted designer suits, and exchanged carefully practiced smiles, hoping fate would place them within his line of sight. Yet Damian arrived exactly as he always did, calm, composed, and impossible to impress. His charcoal tuxedo was tailored with quiet precision rather than extravagance, and every measured step reflected years of discipline rather than arrogance. Conversations softened as he entered. Cameras flashed from behind the velvet ropes outside, but inside the ballroom he acknowledged no one beyond a courteous nod to the event organizers. His expression remained unreadable, his silver-gray eyes drifting across the crowd with detached patience. Compliments found him. Introductions surrounded him. Subtle attempts to capture his attention unfolded with polished elegance. Damian accepted every greeting with impeccable manners before moving on without lingering for more than a few seconds. To everyone watching, he seemed completely immune to charm. Hidden beyond the center of the ballroom, where no photographers cared to point their lenses, Ethan Brooks quietly replaced empty glasses on a silver serving cart. At 22, he had worked part-time for the foundation for almost a year while finishing graduate school in library science. Most guests never noticed him, and those who did usually mistook him for temporary event staff. That suited Ethan perfectly. He preferred listening to conversations instead of joining them, observing people instead of competing with them. His dark brown hair had begun slipping across his forehead after several hours of work, and every few minutes he brushed it back with the absent-minded habit of someone too busy to care about appearances. When a child accidentally knocked over a sparkling drink near one of the exhibits, Ethan smiled gently, reassured the embarrassed parents that everything was fine, and quietly cleaned the spill before anyone important even realized it had happened. No applause followed. No appreciative audience gathered. Within seconds, everyone returned to watching Damian Blackwood, except Damian himself. As another polished introduction faded into background noise, something unexpected caught his attention across the room. Not glamour, not ambition, not another carefully rehearsed smile. Instead, he noticed the only person in the ballroom who seemed completely uninterested in being noticed at all. Ethan finished wiping the marble floor, helped the little boy recover his dropped toy dinosaur, and continued pushing the serving cart toward the next table without ever realizing someone was watching him. Damian's gaze remained fixed for one heartbeat longer than usual, long enough for an unfamiliar question to settle quietly in his mind. Why was the one person everyone ignored suddenly impossible for him to overlook? Ethan assumed the unfamiliar feeling would disappear by morning. People from Damian Blackwood's world did not remember faces like his. They remembered investors, influential families, and carefully planned introductions. They did not remember the quiet Omega who stacked clean glasses after everyone else had gone home. By sunrise, Ethan was back inside the foundation library, where towering oak shelves replaced glittering chandeliers and silence was welcomed instead of avoided. He spent the first hour returning donated books, updating digital records, and helping a retired teacher locate a collection of American history journals. It was a life that suited him. Predictable, peaceful, invisible. Most of his co-workers appreciated his kindness, but rarely asked personal questions. They knew Ethan always volunteered for extra shifts, brought homemade muffins on Friday mornings, and quietly donated part of every paycheck to the foundation's literacy program. Beyond that, very few people could have described him. Meanwhile, 20 floors above the city, Damian sat inside Blackwood Tower reviewing quarterly reports with the same calm precision that had earned him respect throughout the organization. Numbers made sense. Contracts followed logic. People, however, were becoming unusually difficult to ignore. Halfway through a presentation, his attention drifted toward an entirely different question. Who was the young man cleaning the ballroom last night? His executive assistant noticed the silence. When Damien finally looked up, he spoke with complete composure. The foundation employee who assisted during the gala. The one helping guests near the West exhibit. I would like his personnel file. The request surprised everyone in the room because Damien had never shown curiosity about temporary staff before. Within an hour, a slim folder rested on his desk. Ethan Brooks, age 22, graduate student, part-time library assistant, excellent performance evaluations, no disciplinary record, volunteer mentor for children's reading programs every Saturday. Damien expected something extraordinary hidden beneath the ordinary details, but there was nothing dramatic to discover. No influential relatives, no public recognition, no calculated attempt to gain attention. The simplicity itself became remarkable. Later that afternoon, Damien canceled a lunch reservation at an exclusive private club and instead drove to the foundation campus without public notice. Officially, he intended to inspect several renovation projects. Unofficially, even he could not explain why he found himself walking toward the library. Inside, afternoon sunlight poured through tall windows, warming rows of books that had been carefully organized decades earlier. Ethan stood on a rolling ladder, placing returned novels onto the highest shelf, completely focused on making sure every spine aligned neatly with the next. He did not notice Damien enter until another patron quietly stepped aside. Ethan climbed down, holding a small stack of books against his chest. "Good afternoon," he said with the same gentle politeness he offered everyone. "Can I help you find something?" There was no nervous excitement in his voice, no attempt to impress, no expectation that the city's most admired heir required special treatment. Damien studied him for a brief moment before answering. "I believe I was looking for a particular book." Ethan smiled softly. "Do you remember the title?" Damien almost admitted that he had not come searching for a book at all. Instead, he glanced toward the nearest shelf, reading the first title he saw. Ethan immediately turned, leading him through the quiet aisles with patient confidence, never realizing that for the first time in many years, Damien Blackwood had willingly followed someone else's direction instead of expecting the world to follow his. Damien returned to Blackwood Tower with the borrowed novel resting on the seat beside him, untouched for the entire drive. It was not the book occupying his thoughts, but the quiet certainty in Ethan Brooks's voice. No hesitation, no admiration, no carefully measured attempt to gain favor. It was the first completely ordinary conversation Damien had experienced in years, and somehow it lingered longer than negotiations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Over the following week, official business seemed to lead him repeatedly toward the foundation campus. One afternoon, he reviewed scholarship proposals. Another morning, he attended a meeting about expanding community education programs. Every visit appeared perfectly reasonable on paper, yet each one ended the same way. His footsteps eventually carried him toward the library. Ethan never questioned the pattern. Whenever Damien appeared, he greeted him exactly as he greeted every visitor, with a calm smile and quiet professionalism. Sometimes Damien borrowed another book he never intended to read. Sometimes he simply asked about the history of the building or the foundation's literacy projects. Ethan answered every question with genuine enthusiasm, speaking more comfortably about forgotten authors and children's reading clubs than about himself. The contrast fascinated Damien. Most people spoke endlessly about their achievements. Ethan always redirected attention towards someone else. One rainy Saturday afternoon, Damien arrived unexpectedly after finishing an inspection at one of the foundation's neighborhood learning centers. The library itself was nearly empty because of the weather, but laughter drifted from a meeting room downstairs. Curious, Damien followed the sound until he stopped outside an open doorway. Inside, nearly 20 children sat in a circle around Ethan, listening with complete attention as he read from an illustrated adventure novel. He changed his voice for every character, making the youngest children laugh while encouraging the older ones to imagine each scene for themselves. After the story ended, he handed out donated books, kneeling beside every child to recommend something based on their interests rather than their reading level. One little girl admitted she struggled with long chapters. Ethan smiled warmly and replied, Every great reader starts with one page. You do not have to finish the whole mountain today. Just enjoy the next step. Damien remained unnoticed in the hallway for several minutes. He had attended charity galas where speeches about helping children earned standing ovations from influential donors. None of those speeches carried the quiet sincerity he witnessed in that small room. Ethan was not performing kindness for recognition. He behaved exactly the same when nobody important was watching. As the children left with excited smiles and backpacks filled with books, Ethan gathered the remaining supplies into neat boxes. He finally noticed Damien standing near the doorway and looked mildly surprised. "I did not realize you were here," he admitted. Damien stepped inside, glancing at the colorful drawings covering one wall. "You volunteer every Saturday?" Ethan nodded. "Reading changed my life when I was young. I figured the least I could do was pass that gift to someone else." There was no dramatic speech after those words, no expectation of praise. Ethan simply picked up another stack of books and carried them toward a storage shelf. Damien instinctively reached for the heaviest box before Ethan could lift it. Ethan blinked in surprise before offering a grateful smile that was small, genuine, and completely unguarded. For reasons Damien could not yet explain, that simple smile felt more valuable than every polished compliment he had heard throughout the past decade. And somewhere beyond the quiet walls of the library, unseen eyes had already begun noticing that the heir to the Blackwood Empire was spending far too much time around an Omega, whom almost everyone else still overlooked. By the beginning of the following week, quiet conversations had started spreading through circles that normally paid attention only to major business deals and exclusive social events. Damien Blackwood had been seen visiting the Foundation again, then once more. No official statement explained why, and that silence only encouraged more speculation. Some assumed he was preparing a major charitable investment. Others believed he was evaluating future leadership within the Foundation. No one imagined the truth because almost no one had noticed the person who had quietly become the reason those visits continued. Ethan remained completely unaware of the growing curiosity. His schedule never changed. He opened the library before sunrise, organized returned books, welcomed students preparing for exams, and spent every lunch break helping elderly visitors navigate the digital archive. Whenever coworkers teased him about working too hard, he simply laughed and replied that books had always taken care of him, so it felt natural to return the favor. Recognition had never been his goal. Peace was enough. Across the city, however, Damien found himself noticing details that once would have escaped his attention entirely. During meetings, he caught himself wondering what new novel Ethan might recommend next. While reviewing expansion plans for the Foundation, he automatically considered how additional libraries could benefit neighborhoods that lacked educational resources. His senior advisors welcomed the renewed focus on community investment without realizing its true inspiration. Even Damien questioned the change. He had spent years believing that leadership required emotional distance. Yet every conversation with Ethan reminded him that influence carried far greater meaning when it quietly improved someone else's life. Several members of the Foundation board invited Damien to attend a small appreciation luncheon honoring volunteers. The event was intentionally modest, held inside a renovated community center rather than an elegant ballroom. Ethan nearly declined because he preferred spending the afternoon preparing reading materials for the weekend program, but his supervisor insisted every volunteer should be recognized. When Ethan arrived, he chose a seat near the back of the room, hoping to applaud the award recipients before slipping away unnoticed. Moments later, Damien entered as the guest speaker. The audience immediately straightened in their chairs, expecting another polished executive presentation. Instead, Damien spoke briefly about service, gratitude, and the quiet impact created by people whose names rarely appeared in headlines. His eyes naturally drifted toward Ethan several times without conscious intention. A few guests followed that gaze, exchanging puzzled expressions. They searched the room for the mysterious individual receiving so much silent attention and eventually landed on the reserved young Omega, sitting near the coffee station. Whispered questions began moving from table to table. Who was he? Was he related to someone important? Had they met before? Ethan sensed curious glances, but assumed they belonged to someone else. After the luncheon ended, he thanked the organizers, collected a box of donated children's books, and headed toward the parking lot. Before he reached his aging compact sedan, Damien caught up with him carrying another box that had been left behind. "You forgot these," he said. Ethan smiled with genuine appreciation. "Thank you. The kids will probably finish every one of them by next Saturday." Damien looked at the overflowing box before asking, "Would you mind if I helped deliver them?" Ethan blinked, uncertain whether he had heard correctly. At that exact moment, across the parking lot, several influential guests watched the brief exchange unfold in stunned silence. Realizing this was no coincidence anymore, and for the first time, someone quietly decided that the invisible Omega deserved far more attention than they were willing to accept. The drive to the neighborhood learning center lasted less than 30 minutes. Yet Ethan spent most of the trip wondering whether he should have politely declined Damien's unexpected offer. The Blackwood heir was accustomed to boardrooms, international conferences, and exclusive gatherings attended by the city's most influential people. The modest community center, surrounded by maple trees and a small public playground, belonged to a completely different world. When they arrived, several children spotted Ethan through the front window and rushed outside with bright smiles, calling his name before he had even stepped out of his compact sedan. Their excitement made him laugh, and within seconds they were asking which new stories he had brought this week. Damien quietly carried the heavier box toward the entrance without announcing who he was or expecting special treatment. Inside, colorful drawings decorated the walls, mismatched bookshelves lined every corner, and volunteers greeted families by their first names. It was simple, welcoming, and filled with genuine warmth. Ethan immediately introduced Damien to the program director, Mrs. Harper, an energetic retired elementary school principal who thanked every volunteer as though they were lifelong friends. She shook Damien's hand with a smile that suggested she recognized only a helpful visitor, not one of the city's most recognizable business leaders. Damien seemed unexpectedly comfortable with that. As the afternoon unfolded, he watched Ethan move naturally from child to child, recommending books, encouraging hesitant readers, and celebrating every small success as though it deserved national attention. One young boy proudly finished reading an entire chapter aloud without stopping, and Ethan applauded so enthusiastically that every other child joined in. Damien realized something remarkable. Ethan had an extraordinary ability to make people feel seen, especially those who believed no one noticed them. It was the very quality Ethan never realized he possessed himself. Before leaving, Damien quietly asked Mrs. Harper what the program needed most. She hesitated before admitting that many families shared outdated books because the budget barely covered new materials. Damien simply nodded and thanked her for her honesty. 3 days later, dozens of brand new books arrived with no public announcement, no media coverage, and no mention of the Blackwood name anywhere on the donation. Only the foundation administration knew where they had come from, and they honored Damien's request to keep the gift anonymous. Ethan assumed a generous publisher had stepped forward after hearing about the program. Meanwhile, word continued spreading through social circles that Damien Blackwood had been seen outside another official event with the same quiet Omega. This time there were photographs taken from a respectful distance, showing the two carrying identical boxes into a community center rather than attending an exclusive gala. The images appeared harmless, yet they sparked endless conversations. Invitations that once filled Damien's calendar suddenly included subtle questions about his recent schedule. Several well-connected Omegas who had spent years hoping to earn his attention found themselves studying the photographs with growing confusion. None of them understood why someone so ordinary had become a familiar presence beside the city's most sought-after alpha. Ethan remained completely unaware of the speculation until one afternoon a co-worker jokingly asked whether he had become friends with Damien Blackwood. Ethan laughed softly and dismissed the idea, insisting they had simply crossed paths through foundation projects. But as he looked toward the library in trance a few moments later, he saw Damien walking inside once again, carrying another borrowed novel with an easy smile that had become just a little more natural than before, and for the first time Ethan began to wonder whether these repeated meetings were no longer accidental at all. By the end of the month, Damien no longer needed an official reason to visit the foundation. His calendar still reflected meetings, inspections, and charitable planning sessions, but everyone closest to him recognized a subtle change. He stayed longer than necessary. He asked more questions than before. Most surprising of all, he smiled more often. His executive assistant noticed it first, but wisely kept the observation private. Damien himself barely acknowledged it. Whenever he walked through the library doors and saw Ethan helping a student locate the perfect novel or patiently explaining a research database to an elderly visitor, the constant pressure that surrounded his daily life seemed to fade into the background. Ethan, however, was beginning to notice the attention their conversations attracted. Staff members exchanged curious glances whenever Damien arrived. Visitors whispered after he left. A few unfamiliar guests even lingered near the circulation desk longer than necessary, pretending to browse while quietly observing every interaction. Ethan found the sudden curiosity uncomfortable. He had spent years building a peaceful routine where nobody expected anything from him beyond kindness and reliability. Now that routine felt as though invisible eyes followed every step. One afternoon, after Damien borrowed another novel he would probably never finish, Ethan finally gathered the courage to ask the question that had been quietly growing in his mind. "May I ask you something?" Damien looked up from signing the checkout receipt. "Of course." Ethan hesitated before speaking. "You have access to the largest private library in the city. Why do you keep coming here?" The question carried no suspicion, only sincere curiosity. Damien considered several polished answers before realizing none of them felt honest enough. He slowly closed the book in his hands and met Ethan's eyes. "Because this is one of the few places where people treat me like an ordinary person." Ethan smiled gently. "I thought everyone wanted to be treated as extraordinary." Damien shook his head. Sometimes extraordinary can become lonely. The simple confession lingered between them. Ethan did not immediately reply. Instead, he quietly placed another returned book onto the cart before saying, "Then I hope you always feel welcome here." Those words settled more deeply than either of them expected. Neither realized someone standing near the magazine shelves had overheard part of the conversation. The visitor, a young Omega from one of the city's influential families, had attended several exclusive galas hoping to earn Damien's attention over the years. Watching him speak so comfortably with an unknown library assistant made little sense. Before leaving, the visitor discreetly took a photograph of Damien walking beside Ethan through the reading room. By evening, the image had quietly circulated among several private social groups frequented by prominent families. The comments appeared polite on the surface, yet beneath them grew unmistakable disbelief. People questioned who Ethan Brooks was, how he had gained Damien's trust, and why the Blackwood heir seemed increasingly willing to spend his free time with someone who possessed neither wealth nor social influence. Ethan remained completely unaware of the discussions unfolding across the city. He locked the library at sunset, carried a bag of donated books to his car, and drove home along familiar streets believing it had been another ordinary day. Damien watched the taillights disappear before returning to his own vehicle, unaware that quiet curiosity had now transformed into widespread speculation, and that people who had never cared about Ethan's existence were suddenly preparing to make him the center of attention, whether he wanted it or not. Ethan had never cared about public opinion because for most of his life there had been very little public opinion to care about. He had blended naturally into every room he entered, content to let louder voices fill the silence while he quietly focused on his work. That changed the following week when ordinary routines suddenly felt unfamiliar. People who had walked past him for months without a second glance now smiled a little too eagerly. Visitors who claimed to need directions somehow managed to ask whether Damien Blackwood came to the library often. Even a local newspaper covering one of the Foundation's literacy events requested a brief interview with Ethan, describing him as a volunteer connected to one of the city's most respected philanthropists. Ethan politely declined, insisting the children deserved the attention instead. Unfortunately, declining attention did not make it disappear. Damien noticed the shift almost immediately. During one afternoon visit, he found Ethan returning books with the same calm professionalism as always, yet there was a faint weariness behind his gentle smile. After the last visitor left, Damien quietly asked, "Has something been bothering you?" Ethan hesitated before answering. "Nothing serious. It is simply strange when people become interested in someone they never noticed before." Damien understood exactly what he meant. The attention surrounding Ethan had never been earned by fame or ambition. It had arrived because of him. That realization settled heavily on his mind. "I am sorry," Damien said sincerely. "I never intended to complicate your life." Ethan looked genuinely surprised by the apology. "You did not do anything wrong. People create their own stories. We cannot control that." Damien nodded, but the answer brought little comfort. For the first time in years, he questioned whether his presence was helping Ethan or quietly placing an unfair burden on someone who had never asked for it. 2 days later, Ethan arrived at the neighborhood learning center carrying several new reading kits for the weekend program. As he unlocked the front door, he noticed fresh flower boxes lining the entrance and newly repaired benches surrounding the playground. Mrs. Harper greeted him with unmistakable excitement. "We received another anonymous donation," she explained. "The roof repairs are fully funded. Every classroom is getting new computers, and the children will have enough books for years." Ethan smiled warmly, believing another generous supporter had discovered the center. He never imagined the decision had been made after one quiet conversation about limited resources. Later that afternoon, Damien stopped by carrying coffee for the volunteers. There were no photographers, no formal speeches, and no executives accompanying him. He spent the next hour helping children assemble simple wooden bookshelves, laughing softly whenever a loose screw rolled across the floor. Watching him kneel beside a group of excited elementary school students, Ethan saw someone entirely different from the composed air described in newspaper headlines. This Damien was patient, approachable, and quietly thoughtful. As the sun began to set, the children gathered outside to thank every volunteer before heading home with stacks of borrowed books tucked beneath their arms. One little girl hugged Ethan before turning toward Damien with complete innocence. "Are you coming back next Saturday too?" she asked hopefully. Damien glanced toward Ethan before answering with an easy smile. "If I am invited, I would like that very much." Ethan returned the smile without realizing how naturally it came now. While across the parking lot an unfamiliar luxury sedan remained parked with its windows slightly lowered, and someone inside watched the entire exchange before slowly driving away, carrying questions that would soon change the peaceful rhythm both of them had come to treasure. The invitation arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning in a cream-colored envelope embossed with the Blackwood Foundation seal. Ethan assumed it had been delivered to the library by mistake until he unfolded the card and found his own name printed beneath the words Guest of Honor. The foundation was hosting its annual Community Impact Celebration, recognizing volunteers, educators, and donors who had quietly strengthened neighborhoods across the city. Ethan immediately walked to his supervisor's office to explain that someone else deserved the invitation more than he did. His supervisor only smiled and shook her head. "You earned this long before anyone noticed," she said gently. "The difference is that now people are finally paying attention." Ethan accepted the invitation with obvious hesitation. Large public events had never been comfortable for him, especially after weeks of whispered conversations and curious glances. Across town, preparations for the evening followed a very different rhythm. Damien reviewed the event schedule with his executive team before closing the folder earlier than expected. One board member casually mentioned that several influential families hoped to introduce their sons during the reception, believing the celebration would provide an ideal opportunity for meaningful connections. Damien listened politely before answering with calm certainty. "Tonight is about recognizing service, not arranging introductions." The room fell silent. Everyone understood that the discussion had ended. As evening arrived, the grand ballroom filled with familiar faces from business, education, and charitable organizations. Unlike the previous gala, Ethan did not arrive wearing a volunteer badge. He wore a simple navy suit that fit perfectly without drawing unnecessary attention. And although he still preferred standing near the edge of the room, it was impossible for people not to recognize him now. Conversations paused as guests quietly connected the face from recent photographs with the reserved young Omega, who had somehow become a regular presence beside Damien Blackwood. Ethan greeted people with the same humility he always had, thanking volunteers, congratulating teachers, and congratulating scholarship recipients instead of speaking about himself. Then the ballroom doors opened once more. Damien entered with his usual quiet confidence, acknowledging familiar faces before his eyes instinctively searched the room. The moment he spotted Ethan, his expression softened almost imperceptibly. Without hesitation, he changed direction, crossing the ballroom while dozens of conversations gradually faded into silence. Several influential guests expected him to stop at their tables first. Instead, Damien walked directly to Ethan. "I am glad you came," he said warmly. Ethan smiled with genuine relief. "I almost stayed home." Damien looked around the crowded ballroom before replying. "I would have been disappointed if you had." It was a simple exchange, yet everyone close enough to hear it understood its significance. Damien then did something even more unexpected. As the master of ceremonies invited honored guests toward the front of the ballroom, Damien stepped slightly aside and gestured for Ethan to walk beside him rather than behind him. There was no dramatic announcement, no elaborate declaration, only a quiet invitation offered with complete confidence. Ethan hesitated for a brief moment before accepting. Together they crossed the ballroom while hundreds of eyes followed them in stunned silence. Some guests exchanged confused looks. Others whispered behind careful smiles. A few quietly lowered their glasses, realizing that this was no passing curiosity. Damien Blackwood had made his choice clear without saying a single extraordinary word, and somewhere beyond the applauding crowd, several powerful observers recognized that the quiet Omega everyone had once overlooked had just become the one person impossible to ignore. The applause that filled the ballroom that evening eventually faded, but the choice Damien had made did not. By walking beside Ethan instead of placing him quietly in the background, he had answered every whispered question without delivering a speech. In the weeks that followed, invitations continued arriving at Blackwood Tower from influential families hoping to arrange private introductions, elegant dinners, and carefully planned social gatherings. Damien declined each one with the same respectful courtesy. His schedule became increasingly devoted to expanding educational programs, community libraries, and literacy initiatives across the state. Whenever reporters asked what had inspired the foundation's renewed focus on neighborhood learning centers, Damien simply replied that lasting success was measured by the opportunities created for others. He never mentioned Ethan by name, yet everyone close to the foundation understood where the inspiration had begun. Ethan refused to let the attention change him. Every morning, he unlocked the library before sunrise, just as he always had. He still organized shelves, repaired worn book covers, and greeted every visitor with the same patient smile. The only noticeable difference was that more volunteers had joined the literacy program after hearing about its work. Donations increased. New reading rooms opened in underserved neighborhoods. Children who had once shared outdated books now carried home brand new novels every weekend. Ethan considered that the greatest reward of all. One quiet afternoon, several months later, Damien visited the library carrying a folder instead of another borrowed novel. He placed it gently on the circulation desk. Inside were architectural drawings for a new public learning center that would include classrooms, digital resources, children's reading spaces, and one of the largest community libraries in the region. Ethan studied the plans in astonishment before looking up. "This is incredible," he whispered. Damien smiled. "There is one condition." Ethan raised an eyebrow with quiet curiosity. Damien pointed toward the final page, where the proposed name appeared in elegant lettering. "The Brooks Community Library." Ethan immediately shook his head. "It should not be named after me." Damien answered softly. "You spent years helping people discover stories without asking for recognition. It is time your own story encourages someone else." For a long moment, Ethan could not find the words to respond. Several years passed, and the library became exactly what Damien had envisioned. Families gathered there every day. Students prepared for college entrance exams. Children discovered the joy of reading in bright, welcoming rooms filled with hope instead of silence. Visitors often noticed two familiar figures walking through the building together. One was the respected leader of the Blackwood organization, admired for his calm judgment and unwavering integrity. The other was still the gentle Omega who remembered every child's favorite book and greeted every visitor as though they mattered. People occasionally asked Damien why, out of everyone who had sought his attention over the years, he had chosen Ethan. Damien always gave the same quiet answer. "The world kept telling me to notice the loudest voice in the room. Ethan reminded me that the strongest hearts are usually the quietest." Long before anyone else believed in him, Ethan had learned to see value in people who felt invisible. In the end, That quiet kindness transformed not only his own future, but also the future of countless others, proving that the rarest kind of strength is not found in power, wealth, or status, but in choosing to see the person everyone else overlooked.